Pasadena Conservatory of Music came to me with a project for the Fine Arts Festival that Pasadena has every 3 years, I believe. And the theme of this year's festival was skin. And the conservatory wanted to do a photographic exhibition in conjunction with some of their performances and other items that they were doing that would speak to this year's theme. Their concept is that they wanted to show the interaction of skin with musical instruments. And they wanted to take a slightly different tack. The original concept of the series was to kind of focus on the areas that are a little less glamorous. And by that meaning battle scars of musicians and points of contact. Things like the hickey on a violinist's neck or calluses and the like. And so that's kind of how it initially started. We originally started to do it as a black and white. They wanted a black and white series. My personal feeling, some people agree, some people don't, is that, with black and white, you really focus more in on the image, the viewer does. And that is because there's less things to distract them from the actual message. It's simply black and white and the tonalities in between, and you really start to focus more in on the lighting and the composition, and more importantly, the content of the image, rather than getting wowed by bright colors. And then we're just going to focus on 10 to 12 different instruments and create a series of images that might get across that interaction of human and instrument. So the cello ones that we're looking at here, the first one was kind of over the shoulder, looking down, getting both hands in the image. We were focusing more in on the top part of the instrument and where that finger contact with the strings came into being. And the one thing that I found happened through each of these series is we started out at a very generic perspective. Everything was very basic, so I'm just kind of working around the musician and the instrument, and this first one over the shoulder, to me, tends to be somewhat generic. I wasn't thrilled with it because it didn't speak to me too much about the instrument itself. It was almost even hard to tell what was going on. So we moved to this next series, which we were focusing on motion, and we were doing what's called dragging the shutter, or doing a long exposure with the camera, such that you actually see the blur of motion as the musician's playing. I think it was a nice approach, but again, I don't think it got to the point that was really, just spot on and exactly what we're looking for, that just screamed out what this instrument was about. So even though the motion effect is quite successful, the original concept of the project was where the skin meets the instrument, and that point is actually blurry in this photo, so it really didn't work. And we got to this last one here, and the last one just, to me, really spoke of the instrument. The lighting was right on the instrument and the skin, and just because we didn't have any lighting in the background on this one, and it just made this hand kind of floating in blackness. And even though it's not blurred, it has a sense of motion in it because of the tilt of the cello and the implied motion of the hand. So that was really kind of the one that won out. These bassoon images were among some of the harder ones from a technical standpoint, and yet some of the more successful ones as far as capturing what the original concept of the series was. The first one, again, starting out a little more generically, pulled back a little bit, kind of playing with the light on the instrument. From a technical standpoint, as a photographer, we're always wanting, whenever we're shooting metal, we're wanting a nice shape and turning on the metal, and so we were kind of refining the lighting in this first one on the instrument itself, but it didn't show much interaction. It was more like the musician was simply showing us the instrument. And so we started to pull in a little bit tighter with the second one, and even with that, the second one didn't have a sense of catching anything in motion or in action. And again, we were still working with refining the lighting a little bit. The background light tended to be a little overpowering for this particular shot. My concept as I was going through these images is I just wanted just a hint of a glow in the background of these. I didn't really want a lot of the background to play a big part. I have to say that we weren't overly successful in capturing our original concept. Part of it is because some of it was not practical. Again, we were talking about some of the war wounds of being a musician, and there was conversation of the impressions that you would get on the inside of your lip while you're playing a woodwind, or I guess it was a sax that would really provide that. And it became very impractical to have somebody flip their lower lip out so we could take a picture of it. It didn't really work. We move on to the last one, and that's where we really got it. We really kind of tweaked the lighting a little bit so that as the musician pulled her fingers away from these holes, you could actually really see the indentation on her fingers. And it's a matter of tweaking the lighting, tweaking her position just enough so that we get that nice drop shadow to accentuate the impression that it's making. And it's really just that middle finger there that's really showing it. You need to know, as a photographer, you need to know your lighting. You need to know the technical aspects of light and how it plays on texture and form to be able to go, okay, this is what I need to do with the light in order to achieve the tonality and the shadow that I'm looking for. These piano photos, again, started out from a very generic mode. I was just shooting from 3/4 behind and looking down at the musician's hands on the keyboard. And it wasn't doing much for me. Part of it is it's tough because you've seen so many shots of pianos, and it's just, how do you take this and make it something slightly different than what you've seen before? We had talked about before how it's just the nature of our vision that we go to the brightest thing in a photograph first. That's the first thing we look at, is the brightest thing. The second thing we look at in a photograph, especially if we're talking about black and white imagery, is the sharpest thing in the image, the thing that's most in focus. So first you go to bright, then you go to sharpness. And so I wanted to play with that a little bit on these, where we're trying to use a shallow depth of field or a very small area of sharp focus to help guide the viewer to exactly what we're trying to talk about. First one, not so successful at that. The second one, we kind of came down to the keyboard level to kind of look across the keyboard, and it started to work because, again, the foreground's out of focus, the far background is out of focus, and our point of focus is where her fingers are touching the keys. But again, it wasn't singing to me. I wasn't getting a true feel for the environment and for the instrument itself. And right towards the end, we just came right up on top of the keyboard, shooting with a moderate wide-angle lens so as to really fill the bottom of the frame with the keyboard and really give a sense of perspective and try and lengthen this whole instrument and have it feel a little more massive. The other thing that it does for us is, again, it's using composition and lighting and the perspective to guide the viewer where you want them to look. So again, the foreground's out of focus. The brightest part of the picture is back there where it's sharp and her fingers are hitting the keyboard. Then just the whole pyramid or triangle shape forces your eye up into that sharp area where the action's taking place. To me, this one was hands down the winner, compositionally speaking. It's one of those things where you tweak, and finally get, there it is. So for each of these shots, ultimately we shot about 100 frames for each instrument. That may seem like a lot to some people, but it's what you need to do to properly explore each instrument, and it gave us time to kind of play a little bit as well. I would say that, the important things that really came into play here, especially because it's in black and white, is really technically knowing your lighting, technically knowing composition, technically knowing your tools. You want to know your tools so well that you don't have to think about the technical aspect. These tools that you have, the technique, the theory, all of that becomes so second nature that it allows you to not have to think about them, and you can just concentrate on being creative.